Good today. Oh, hey
Yeah.
everybody! Welcome back to the Only You Live. We've been away for a little while doing some things. Dr. Pino's been doing some traveling, and we've been doing a lot of writing, of course. And today we are going to talk about a topic which I find very interesting. I'm not particularly family oriented, never really have been, but so many people out there are, especially during the holidays, in particular Thanksgiving. However, it seems like Thanksgiving has really kind of changed. It has become something a little different between COVID and Trump and so many other things. Behaviors that in the past were unacceptable are now totally acceptable and have caused an additional strain in our society and in our families. So, Dr. Patino, how are we going to get through this Thanksgiving?
It is fascinating because in my career as a psychiatrist, working for the last 30 some years, uh, we've always had this kind of love hate relationship with things like Thanksgiving and Christmas, right? I mean, Thanksgiving is kind of like the first step toward preparing for the Christmas season, regardless of what your religion is. And I do see a change over the last 3 to 5 years, right? In terms of those of us who survived COVID, the changes in politics, the comfort that people have developed with conflict, right? As if conflict has become a coping skill.
Hmm.
Okay, by being conflicting, I don't have to deal with you, and I can just reject you, right?
So, kind
Now,
of a way of distancing themselves from this or avoidance,
well,
really?
I think that they're avoiding and distancing themselves, and they're projecting a lot of their fears and paranoias and a lot of different things. But that is being constant. That's not a Thanksgiving issue. That it just becomes more evident because when we get into the Thanksgiving season, we get into going back to places that in the past were the places where you could express your emotions and let things out, and you would have people having good values of forgiveness and gratitude and being uh, having humility and things of that sort that would allow you to express without being judged. And I
Hmm.
think that's at the core of what we kind of losing. We're losing safe spaces. So Thanksgiving, as dysfunctional as conflicting as it used to be in the past, it was a place to discharge, right? It was a place to let our emotions loose with people that we felt were alike us and that they were understanding and empathic. And it didn't matter our political background or any of those things or religious inclinations or lack of. You could be you in Thanksgiving at home. What has changed though is that now um, everybody is on a task for themselves, right? What's in it for me? And everybody wants to be recognized, and everybody wants to be lauded, and everybody wants to be the person, right? So things like the more successful, okay, the most intelligent, the most likable, the most beautiful becomes a center of attention, okay, and it becomes a center of competition
Hmm.
because on one hand you don't want to miss being with your family, on the other hand you have to be prepared to attack. How am I going to deal with those people that I know I'm going to be critical of me? How am I going to deal with them talking to me about uh, having lost my job without me feeling judged, with me feeling criticized, right? So you see, going back to the times of understanding requires everybody being willing to and willing to do a number of different things, right?
So what do you since well, again, home, Thanksgiving, the meal, all about being a safe space, but now that that's changed and being kind of a field of competition, in more detail, what are the steps to change that? What can I do if I'm showing up? And by the way, I find it funny you say that because that's exactly what we hear, right? Someone says, "Oh, what are you doing?" They say, "Oh, I have to go see my family or my in-laws or this," and you're like, "Oh, you don't seem very excited." They go, "No, because," and they list all those things that they know are going to be criticized or judged. Um, or the different again political sensibilities that are out there. So what can one do as an individual to help them survive? Because they're not going to change the rest of them. We know that. But what can I do or somebody else or whomever? I'm really good. I don't really even do these things, but
You see, you probably don't even go, right? So,
well, this time I am going to, but of course, my wife's family doesn't invite us anywhere, so we're going to her good friend. But her good friend's family has an amazing amount of conflict within it, which is crazy to observe. It's really weird where I can be an outside observer to this thing, of this chaos. So for me. The disconnect is what allows me to survive it, but I watch these other people in tons of turmoil and emotional stress in a time that shouldn't be so. So what's the key for the individual to get through this?
well, this is going to sound kind of simple, but I'm not an excessively religious person, even though I was raised Catholic. I go to church, and when I go to church, which is not very often, okay, I mean, probably my wife would want me to go more often, but I don't. There are certain values that kind of become automatic when you walk into a church, right? And it doesn't matter what your religion is. You could be Muslim, Catholic, Christian, uh, Jewish. It doesn't matter because they're all the same values. When you walk into a church, there's something about the place, right, that actually forces you to get into put your values hat and to think about things like gratitude, patience, humility, hope, respect, forgiveness. I mean, all those things that should be universal, right? But why is it that it's only in certain places that we express that? And in order for people to have a good time in Thanksgiving, they really need to think about establishing those parameters and those values before Thanksgiving. Meaning, let's listen more and let's talk less, and let's express ourselves in ways that express gratitude, humility, generosity, forgiveness, respect, hope, compassion, right? And it doesn't mean that you have to live your life like that. Maybe you think you're a tough guy, and you're always right, and you're very sensitive to criticism and rejection, and you're more comfortable in your bubble of misery, even though you may be in the bubble of misery with other people, right? And you're sharing your misery with others, and that's your baseline of comfort. If you're going to walk out of your bubble of misery with the rest of the world, you need to understand that most people don't want to be with you there.
Mm.
And you probably need to take the risk of walking away from that place and then start communicating values, not ideas. And that's been a tremendous change. We've seen a big change over the last 3 or 5 years from value-based communication to idea-based communication, and that's problematic.
Yeah, it seems so because it's all these ideologues getting together and bashing against one another. Question for those who are not like me, and that I'd be very happy to have just this be another day, even though I really enjoy the food. I will give you that.
Mhm.
Um, but for those who are alone because they have no one to be with, I know you deal with people all the time. Loneliness, and admittedly, I'm a super lucky person. I've never experienced that. I've been alone. I love solitude personally, but I know a lot of people for whom any time alone is very painful and difficult. What advice do you have for them in this upcoming season, in particular for Thanksgiving? Because I think it's different than the holidays in the sense of Christmas. Thanksgiving is non-religious, so what would you tell them?
You see, loneliness is a complex matter because the underpinnings of loneliness come from different places. And it's a whole gamut of different intensities, right? And different choices. There are people who are alone because they don't have anybody. There are people who are alone because they choose to be alone, and they're miserable alone, but they choose to be like that. I mean, there are people who are alone because they're afraid of approaching other people. But because I deal with this every day, and I deal with kids who feel they're alone because they don't have anybody, they have been abandoned. In their life, survival has been to fight loneliness for survival purposes, right? So what I always tell them is, you're never alone. You're always with you, right? The problem is that many people who are lonely because loneliness becomes safety. And humans always will settle for safety, even though that includes loneliness, even if it includes being alone with somebody you don't like, which is kind of an extreme, right? So loneliness sometimes becomes a survival skill. So it's important to recognize that and be empathic to it, but we need to help people learn how to be with themselves. Step number one. Because if you don't, it becomes extremely difficult to expose yourself to other people, especially those who are vulnerable and have been traumatized or abandoned. They have a lot of trouble trusting people. So there's a factor of loneliness that has to do with trust, and it's a learned behavior. So not everybody who's alone, okay, suffers. There's people who enjoy solitude, but to be able to enjoy solitude, you have to have a good sense of self, okay, and you have almost a protective attitude for your solitude, right? You treasure it.
Oh,
And
I
I
know
know
all
you do.
about that.
I know about that too. But that is the level of mindfulness, okay, that becomes important because you're content with you. Doesn't mean that you're happy with you and that you're elated all the time because you are at the center of the universe and you just want to be with you. You can relate to the rest of the world, but you're not sensitive to being criticized or rejected or abandoned because you have developed a strong sense of value and a strong sense of self. So then I have to say, okay, you need to start developing, and sometimes with professional help and mindfulness and therapy, a sense of who you are. And I really find it fascinating because I work a lot with abandoned children in the hospital, in psychiatric hospital. It is fascinating when I see these kids who have suicidal thinking, right? And they come in. I saw a kid today, and he's been in the hospital 3 times since he was 12. He's 16 now, at least in the hospital with me. So I met him when he was 12. He's 16 now. And he came to the hospital because he's in a group home. He's a ward of the state, and he was abandoned by his parents when he was like 7 years old. And then he tells me, I'm here because I told the group home people that I wanted to kill myself. And then I said, okay, but that's what you told me when you were 12, and that was 4 years ago. And I know you've been in other hospitals in the last 4 years. Something keeps you going, something keeps you surviving. And when you start explaining people that that's something they did, they survived the abandonment, they survived being taken over by other guardians, they survived rejection and criticism from other people, they start understanding that they have some strength, right? And that becomes very important. I was seeing a lady today, she's 72, she has issues with depression, anxiety, and she wasn't feeling very good. She was expressing a lot of downness about herself, and it may have something to do with the holidays, but also issues related to her family. Very religious woman. And then I had to say, okay, because she called me and we set up an urgent meeting because she said I started having thoughts about my life not being worth living. Not that she wanted to kill herself because she wouldn't do that because of her religion, but she started having these thoughts. And then I said, okay, that sounds very interesting. And you sound very down on yourself. And then I said, but you're 72. How do you manage to make it to 72? Right? because we have this tendency to focus so much on the pessimism and negativity of people without trying to focus on their strengths. How can I help you be stronger with what you already have, not from giving you something that somebody else has? And that becomes important. So I think that it starts with people not being afraid of being alone, and then not being afraid of exploring being alone with themselves, right? And the step number three is taking the risk of exposing yourself to the rest of the world and finding out something that we and you and I have talked about many times, that nothing happens.
Mm.
I mean, if you challenge your misery, nothing really happens. I mean, that sounds kind of sad because some people, when they have been feeling sad and lonely and empty and rejected and criticized and abandoned, they think that the rest of the world is like this big party where everybody's happy dancing. No, the purpose of life is not to be happy. Purpose of life is to be content. You know, happiness is like the cherry on top.
Exactly. Well, we've talked about the people who are having conflict. We've talked about the people who are lonely. Now let's talk about that third group of people, the perfectionists, who have decided that this is their shining moment, that this day will go exactly the way they plan and the way they want. But it
Well,
rarely does, and it causes a lot of stress.
you see, and you and I have talked about this. There's never been a definition of normalcy, right? I mean, that's a big, best kept secret in psychiatry and psychology is that we've never defined normalcy. So, normalcy is all of the abnormal behaviors in good balance. So, that's my definition. So, you should expect things to be more like waves, right? So, when you get rigid and perfectionistic, it also becomes a way of avoiding rejection and criticism, right? Meaning, if I'm perfect, nobody can attack me. Nobody's going to say, you missed this, you missed that. Okay. So when I work with people that tend to be very obsessive and very anxious and very perfectionistic, I always try to help them be obsessive and perfectionistic at doing the worst, not doing the best, because they're defining the parameters. And those parameters are very difficult for other people to follow, number one. Second, when you get into situations where you're in places with people that you've known for a long time, those people are very comfortable telling you what's wrong with you. Your parents, your brothers, your sisters, your extended family, your children, right? I mean, that is the worst place to be perfectionistic because they're going to make fun of you for being perfectionistic.
Hmm.
And then if you're not able to tolerate that, then your night is miserable. So I mean, it's like we are talking about football before the program because I just got back from Green Bay, and we were talking about um, football players, right? So think about a football player that goes into thinking that the perfect game is not get hit,
Hmm.
right? No,
Not gonna happen.
no. So the expectation of going into Thanksgiving place is to be you and to be comfortable with the people you're around and to trust, hopefully talking to them before getting together, to setting the boundaries of values, because if not, you're going to go into a place either to bond with negativity and look who is like-minded with you so you can get together with them and be part of that miserable part, maybe receiving things or attacking people, or you're going to go into enable dysfunctional behaviors, or you're going to become avoidant and not try to deal with any conflict, uh, or you're going to end up in in a situation where you think that everybody should be codependent, right? That we need to glorify, all of us against the world, right? Which we've seen a lot of that lately, especially in the political environment.
Tribalism.
Exactly. So we need to
So,
start perpetuating pessimism.
Well, it's in reverse order here. It sounds like these perfectionists have to manage their own expectations and the expectations of their family. The lonely people have to be a little more comfortable with themselves and be willing to take some risk and understand that they are valuable. And for the rest of us, going into the tumult of these very contentious, potentially contentious dinners, to be a little bit more empathetic and
Well,
focus on discussing values instead of
not only
politics.
more empathetic, but you really um, have to go with the attitude of trying to recognize that we're going to a Thanksgiving get together. It should be a place where we can be ourselves, right? Not that you're not going to be criticized or rejected, somebody's going to make fun of you, but in a place where you can try to make change, where you can say, I hear you. I may not agree with you, uh, but we can agree on disagreeing, right? You see, because what happens is things get heated, things get exacerbated because somebody wants to be right. And the question that needs to be asked ourselves, not necessarily asking other people, is what is my purpose of asking this? We really have to have a purpose to engage, because we're not responsible, and sometimes we feel ashamed for others, right, because of what they're doing. We don't have to rescue anybody. Okay? We just have to be in control of what we're saying. And you can choose to talk, you can choose to not talk, you can choose to walk away from the conversation, right? So that's part of the values of humility, you know, the values of respect, especially with older people. We tend to get very critical with them, and start hitting them because of what they did 35 years ago, and or they took you away from the wheel, and all those dumb things that we talk about during Thanksgiving. The uncle who was rich and died, and nothing happened to the rest of the family, and he had a girlfriend. And okay, so what? What is your purpose of bringing this up? What's in it for you, emotionally speaking? If you cannot answer that question, don't get into it.
Mm.
I mean, you can still be there. You can still be drinking your wine and your beer and have a good time. But be in control of what you're saying, and be mindful of what your purpose is for being there, and what your purpose is for opening your mouth.
Good advice. Well, doctor, appreciate your time and your efforts. And if I don't speak to you before that, have a happy Thanksgiving yourself. I know I'm personally thankful to be continuing to work with you here for the next year or so. And we'll see where we move on from there.
Oh, we're going places. Don't worry about that. Thank you.
You take care, sir.